Welcome to CSIS Online. The way we bring you events is changing, but we'll still present live analysis and award-winning digital media from our Dracopolis Ideas Lab. All on your time, live or on demand. This is CSIS Online.
Well, welcome everyone to our event and today's discussion of the reorganization of defense acquisition statutes in Title X United States Code. I am Andrew Hunter. I'm going to be introducing today's event and also joining the panel. But in order to get things kicked off, let me just offer some brief introductory remarks. I am the director of the Defense Industrial Initiatives Group at CSIS, where we focus on the defense acquisition system, and we are very happy to host today's event and discussion in cooperation with the National Defense Industrial Association, who is pitching in to run this event and also pitching in, importantly, to gather additional comments, including expert comments and technical comments on the reorganization of defense statutes. On the event page for this event, we have a link to a comment portal that NDIAA has created to take comments from all comers, but we're most especially hoping for comments from people who work issues of regulation and acquisition statute on a regular basis and have technical comments on the reorganization. We're doing this in reaction to the inclusion of Title 18 of the FY 2021 National Defense Authorization Act, which created a new statutory framework for defense acquisition statutes, which have most of which have been in law, sometimes for decades, but in a very kind of scattered fashion. And we'll talk a little bit more today about the intent of this change and possible advantages of doing it and possible disadvantages of doing it that we can hope to mitigate. Today's event is enabled by general support to CSIS. We don't have any direct sponsor of this event, but we are very thankful to those organizations and individuals who make our work at CSIS possible. There's also an opportunity for you to submit questions to our panel, who are going to be engaging in a discussion moderated by Wesley Hallman in a little while. And so if you want to submit a question, click on that link, type your question in. It's a Google form format, and it will pop up for Wes Hallman to see. And as he moderates the discussion, insert your question into the discussion. We're going to start with a couple of remarks from our government friends and partners who are joining us today. First off, I'm going to turn to Karen Thornton, who is a professional staff member on the House Armed Services Committee, who has a lead role in acquisition policy handled by the committee, and have her talk a little bit about the thinking of the Congress on the inclusion of Title 18 and what they hope to see. And then we're going to have just a couple of thoughts from a representative from the Department of Defense, Phil Rodgers, who's been working this issue for the department as well. So let me turn it over to you, Karen, for your kind of introduction of our discussion and what we ought to be thinking about as we get into the rest of the discussion.
Thank you very much, Andrew, and thank you especially to CSIS and NDIAA for organizing today's event and bringing together such a great group of panelists. This was exactly what we were hoping for in the Congress when we created the delayed enactment of this provision. I know that my dear friend and colleague Moshe Schwartz is going to give you a lot more rich discussion of the history and some of the events that led to this. I want to thank Moshe for being a tremendous partner in this endeavor. From our perspective, and I'm here representing a bicameral and bipartisan group of professional staffers. I joined the ASK last summer, and it's actually one of the things that has been the most rewarding in this work is to be able to work with such a committed and bipartisan team. Together, really what we're hoping to hear from today's discussion and hopefully also a robust engagement with the comment system that NDIA has put together. We're interested in gathering from you all basically three things: a sense of whether the transfer and reorganization of the acquisition statutes in Title X has benefits and what costs might also come with that effort of reorganization. And then, of course, rulemaking is fraught with just opportunity for mistakes. So we also appreciate zooming in at a tactical level on the language in Title 18 with the actual, what I consider to be an instruction manual for moving all the various pieces of the acquisition statutes, but also, as we articulated in the joint explanatory statement, there was no intent to make any policy changes. So if there's anyone on the panel or in the audience who sees an implication of policy, we really would like to hear about that and better understand that. And then finally, we welcome your insights on future steps. The Section 809 panel in their recommendations included recommendations for moving notes. Might that be something that should happen in the future? What are the future implications for the department in implementing these changes in directives and policy? So it's the high level, the granular, the future. We're open to all of it, and we really are grateful for this opportunity and for all the great folks on the panel who are going to share their views today. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Karen. And so your partner in this effort on the government side, Phil Rodgers, who works in the Office of Secretary of Defense at DoD, you were kind enough, you and the Congress were kind enough to task the Department of Defense to comment on Title 18 and to also establish a process for implementing the change in statute and to also gather some public commentary. So we're helping to facilitate DoD's efforts there with today's event. And Phil, if you'd have just any remarks you want to say about how the department is, what you're looking for.
Well, thank you, Andrew, and I appreciate you and everybody putting this on today, and we value the input that we'll get out of this. I'm mostly in listening mode. My office is working the implementation of this for the department. It's been kind of a long time coming. We first saw glimpses of this in the 809 panel recommendations maybe 2.5 years ago. And I remember seeing it at the time and thinking, oh, wow. And now here I am trying to implement all this stuff. So this has been something that's been in motion for a while. And we see it as a pretty big opportunity to, in kind of one fell swoop, it'll be a big lift and a complex chore, but to clean up what has become over years and decades a fairly complex body of law that's difficult to interpret, understand. And we hope that this does make the world a better place, if you will, cleaning up some of that stuff. Something analogous to this was done, and maybe this will come up in a discussion in Title 41 on the civilian side about a decade ago. So this is something very similar to that, and we look forward to trying to perhaps look for some parallelism in how that was done. We certainly do appreciate as well that enactment of all this is delayed for a year, so that gives us a bit of a time to kind of catch up, work through all the various facets of this that touch things in the department. As many of you know, many of the department's regulations, directives, DFARS provisions are all sort of connected and have tentacles back into the statute. So to the degree a lot of that's shifting around, we're going to have to catch up with a lot of the administrative work inside the department, aligning or realigning some of these regulations and instructions. So our kind of our first crack at this is what I'll call QA work. We've already undergone the work of looking through what's been done in the FY21 NDAA, looking for what I'll call errors. There are some perhaps spelling errors, or a plural was used when it shouldn't have been, commas, things like that. We'll take a first look at that. Karen, we're looking forward to meeting with you soon and engaging in a discussion about some of that stuff. And then secondly, then we'll probably look at all the extensive cross-referencing that's in the statute and try to make sure we've got all that spaghetti threaded correctly, if you will. And again, that's sort of another layer of the QA work of looking through all this stuff. And then as we get through that, we're going to have to shift gears, and we've already got some people looking into what are the implications and what do we need to worry about inside the department's own policies and procedures and regulations. And that's going to take just a fair bit of digging to gather up all the right people and start staring at that stuff, come up with a process and a monitoring mechanism to make sure all that has been followed through with. So we look forward to working through this and getting started, and appreciate all the work that's been done to date, and happy to listen to any input and expertise that we've got from the audience today.
Well, thank you, Phil. And I'm going to turn the baton over now to my partner, Wes Hallman, who is Senior Vice President for Strategy and Policy at the National Defense Industrial Association, who's going to moderate the panel discussion. Over to you, Wes.
Thank you, Andrew, and thanks for the opportunity to do this. I think this is a great effort and a bit overdue. Having flown fighters throughout my life, I will tell you that one thing that you notice over time is that the manual gets bigger and much more complex over time and harder to understand. And this is a great opportunity to really do a deep dive into this, clean up some things, and really point to what could be further reform. So with that, I'm just going to introduce the panel and give each of them an opportunity to give some initial framing remarks, and then we'll get into some Q&A. And we'll start with one of the men responsible for this, Mr. Moshe Schwartz. He is the president of Etherton Associates, serving as an expert in defense acquisition and industrial-based policy. He spent 15 years providing analysis and legislative support to Congress on acquisition policy and industrial-based issues. And importantly, for this discussion, he served as executive director of the congressionally mandated advisory panel on streamlining and codifying acquisition regulations, otherwise known as the 809 panel. So over to you, Moshe. All right, well, while we're figuring out his microphone, I'm going to turn it over to—
I got it, Wes. I'm sorry. Can you hear me?
Hello?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Sorry about that. First, I want to thank you and Andrew for inviting me, and Karen for those fine words, and my microphone for now working. But before I start, let me just please give a public acknowledge to Bob Cover, who many of you know, who deserves tremendous credit and public accolades for the work that he has done at the 809 panel and afterwards to support this idea. I think it's really fair to say that we are having this discussion because of his work, and nobody could have done this work but him, no one. Of course, if you think this is a bad idea, you can also blame Bob for this as well, but we'll put that aside. As a little bit of background, to provide a little bit of context, in January 2019, the 809 panel that Wes alluded to recommended reorganizing Title 10 of the US Code with the primary intent of placing all of the acquisition provisions in a single part because it's currently spread throughout Title 10. The recommendation, though, also went substantially farther than that. It also proposed updating and moving note sections that are in the notes below the legislative text into legislative text, deleting some of them, and repealing not only just some notes, but some Title 10 provisions. In the FY19 NDAA, Congress adopted a number of the repeal recommendations the panel made, and they also included Section 800, which created a new Part 5, which is found in Subtitle A of Title 10 of the Code. This new Part 5 was the shell that created the structure for reorganization. But in that year, Congress did not actually move anything around. This effort, and what was in this 21 NDAA, does that. It actually proposes making the moves that were set up then. Okay. What are some of the benefits? I'll tell you some that I see. One is it makes room for acquisition provisions. So we don't have sections like we do now, 2371B, 2374A, or 2410S, right? It will make room for a lot of those. It also puts things in a logical order, so provisions relating to a single issue will actually be in the same place and will make them findable and easier for context. And I think one thing that's important to point out is what this effort does not do. It does not try to impose plain English or otherwise rewrite any of the language at this point. So as Phil mentioned, some might think this is reminiscent of Title 41 effort a number of years ago, and there clearly is some similarities. The Title 41 effort did try to impose some sort of plain English standard that many people think may have had impacts on policy. That is not where this is. So I just wanted to set that stage. And then since Karen opened the door to discuss future steps, I'm going to leap through that door if I can and say on a personal note, I hope this is a first step in a larger effort. I hope that this reorganization gets done, but after it's done, that there's a systematic look at the notes. And those that are permanent fixtures of law, like currently the Middle Tier Acquisition Authority, which is a note in 10 U.S.C. 2302, I believe, that those are moved into the legislative text. And that those that are outdated, such as pilot programs that have expired 30 years ago or more, are removed and repealed from the text. And if a reorganization is completed and the notes are tackled, I think it'll be easier to get our hands around the universe of acquisition laws, and that would set the stage to be able to go chapter by chapter and do a systematic review of the laws and have a really good, robust policy debate on how to improve them. So I honestly suggest that reorganization and dealing with the notes could set the framework for a more informed, robust, and effective, at the end of the day, acquisition reform effort. And I'll leave my comments at that. Thank you.
Thank you, Moshe. Next up, we have Samantha Clark. She is special counsel at Covington and Burling, providing advisory and advocacy support and counseling to clients facing policy, political, and regulatory challenges in the aerospace, defense, national security, and emerging technology sector. She has also served in senior staff positions in the U.S. Senate Armed Services Committee, most recently as Deputy Staff Director and General Counsel. Over to you, Samantha.
Thanks, Wes, and thanks for having me. And I think you all saw me get photobombed by my niece, Lottie, who just got to town and was too excited to give me a hug. So thanks all for your indulgence there. So thanks for hosting this panel on DIA and CSIS. I think this is a really important topic. In my time with Senator McCain, we were reviewing the results of the 809 panel and coordinated a lot with Moshe at the time. And one of the challenges we had was, first of all, how do we explain to members the significant reform, the purpose of it, why we need to do it? And then second of all, there was this big question of what to do about the notes section. And that was sort of mentioned by Karen as well as something they're continuing to look at. There was a recommendation, of course, to clean up a lot of reporting requirements and a lot of notes. And as part of that, I went to Moshe with his old hat on at CRS and said, hey, can you take a look at this with me and kind of walk through with our staff the question of where might there be policy implications? And I know Arun's on the call, and I'm going to call him out a little bit. One of the things that Arun and I were considering was, what if there is this one acquisition contracting officer deep down in the Pentagon, and he's just been relying on this one note for a long time, and that's the guidance that was developed into the memo that's instructing them, and what if we delete it and then it causes a problem? We didn't want to delete anything we weren't absolutely sure wouldn't have an unintended consequence, which was part of why we required DoD to do some additional reporting on that. And I think Karen and her team and Arun and his will continue to evaluate the results of that and decide where it makes sense to update or move notes along with this reorganization. So that's, I think, a continued work in progress, and no doubt it's in great hands with the current Hask&Sask staff. So on the reorganization, I think we did need longer to look at it. When we were initially looking to put the shells in the FY19, there was a question on how far do we go initially? Are we ready to make the whole scale changes, or do we just want to sort of reserve the sections and allow future staff to continue this work because it is so detailed? I loved Mr. Rodgers' comment on, OSD doing the work of looking for all the little errors and cross-references. Gary Leland and I had what we called the rule of 7, which meant there were always 7 errors in the NDAA that you were going to find after it published. And sometimes they were common errors, and sometimes they were really strange, like you accidentally referenced CICRA when you meant to reference DPA. Those kinds of things happen all of the time, and normally we catch them, but you never know. And in such a dramatic restructuring, I do think it's critically important that we have partners at DoD that have that eagle eye and are ensuring anything gets moved is done properly and little technical edits are fixed. So thanks to Phil and his team for continuing to do that important and very tedious work. This will be a process throughout time. I think it's really important to have these discussions between industry associations, the Hill, and DoD. This is kind of a great meeting of minds because we want to hear how this is impactful. The way I think of it is I like to think, does the reorganization support streamlining of the system, of the provision, so that if I'm a new contracting officer being trained, will this help me do my job better? Will it help me understand the differences and the nuance in the law and where the complicated provisions are, where the waivers are, where is everything that I need to understand, and is it easy to follow? And I think we've all recognized that over time, it's really gotten out of hand with sections now having like an A and a B and a reference here and there are things in Title 10, and then there are things in Title 37 sometimes, or Title 50, and making sure that everything, at least within that, what we would call the NDAA Title 8 structure, is fitting within Title 10 where it's most helpful and user-friendly. It really comes down to how user-friendly will this be at the end. And I think everyone shares the goal of making it as user-friendly as possible for industry, for the department, and for Congress to understand how changes they make are fitting within the broader structure, and to be able to make those cross-references, right? We used to make some big changes, especially in the McCain years, and sometimes that would be really challenging because you change one thing and you realize you've changed the law 8 other places and you maybe only knew about 5 of them. And so I do think this is a worthwhile effort. I think that's a great goal, and I look forward to seeing how this shapes up over time with all of these different partners involved in this process to make sure we get it right. So thanks for having me, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thanks, Samantha. And then Andrew's already done a great introduction of what he does now, and I'll turn it over to him for his opening comments.
All right, thanks, Wes. And I can't resist the opportunity to tell an old war story, but I hadn't really planned on it, so I have to confess I haven't done my homework, and I may get some of the details a little wrong. But I'm reminded of when we were creating the statutory recognition of sub-programs of major defense acquisition programs. And that was something the department found very important. They really wanted to be able to establish sub-programs within MDAPs and then track them as sub-programs. But of course, if you're familiar with the Nunn-McCurdy statute, there are implications. If you're tracking things as sub-programs, it can change how the cost reporting works. And so we undertook an effort to rewrite the Nunn-McCurdy statute, which is an infamously complex statute across multiple sections of law to begin with, to accommodate it being sub-programs. And my recollection is that it was actually the Senate that put that in. But in conference, if any of you follow how the process of conference of the Defense Authorization Bill works, the House usually takes responsibility for the statutory language, and then the Senate takes responsibility for the report language. And so it sort of fell to me as the House staffer to go through the final version of the statutory provision to make sure that all the cross-references were right. We hadn't broken anything and we hadn't left anything out. And that was a process that probably took me literally like 3 consecutive days on the one provision of the hundreds of provisions that I had responsibility for. And I finished it, and I very proudly brought it back to the group of staff. and said, now you all please check me to make sure I've done this right. And they all said, no, it's good. We're just going to sign off on it. We don't want to read it. And it was quite a blow to me to know that there was no safeguard, that if I got it wrong, it was just going to be wrong until Phil figured it out for me later on. I'm confident we did make some mistakes, but it is incredibly hard to do. And that was just one tiny piece, the non-McCurdy statute, within what's being undertaken with Title 18. But I will say, so having done that, having lived through that, I'm a big fan of this idea of doing this reorganization. And I'm a fan of it for a particular reason, which is I think we do need to think of what we're trying to accomplish, of an actual outcome for the warfighter, outcome for our national security efforts. And so, I have always conceptualized it as a defense acquisition system that should operate as a system. And you can kind of use systems thinking to think about how we approach delivering capability that is needed for national security. And I think reorganizing these statutes in a perfect world will help us to look at the statute as a support, as an enabler for the defense acquisition system, and to identify where is the statute misaligned with what the system actually requires to operate. Where is it incomplete? Where have we not provided authorities, or where do we have insufficient oversight ability over the defense acquisition system? We can fill in the gaps. And I think there's interesting candidates for those things. It's worth pointing out that the move towards middle tier of acquisition in the last 4-ish years has really taken a lot of programs out of the major defense acquisition program structure that would otherwise be covered by it. And because the rules associated with MDAPs, they're mostly in one place in Title 10, but there's all these notes that apply to MDAPs that are in other places. And so it's not even clear to me that we fully understand what we've exempted programs from and what we haven't exempted programs from within the middle tier of acquisition. Now, it's an answerable question, but I do think this reorganization actually will substantially help us in figuring out what have we applied to middle tier, which is a growing sector, and what have we not applied to it, and what should we apply to it, and what shouldn't we apply to it. And we may have errors in all quadrants of the chart in terms of where we stand today. And that's not a critique. I think that's just the way it is. And middle tier was created specifically to open up a space to do things outside of the MDAP system, and so it was done with great intentionality. But I think it's something we have to continually return to make sure that we've got the right mix. I think it's great that kind of the definition or the layout of the defense acquisition system is one of the first elements of the way that the code is reorganized in Title 18, and I think that'll help us think about it that way. In my own career, in my own time managing the Title 8 of the Defense Authorization Bill, when I had that wonderful responsibility when I worked in the House Armed Services Committee, I think we did identify gaps, and we added significant authorities. We identified gaps in things like rapid fielding, authorities for rapid fielding of capability, previous chairman of the HASC, Duncan Hunter, kind of sort of pioneered a lot of the authorities for rapid fielding of capability, things that I later had the opportunity to execute and to exercise as director of the Joint Rapid Acquisition Cell in DoD. That statutory framework has been built up over multiple NDAAs and is now something that we can codify and make sure that we have a complete suite of authorities as we look to, in the language of one of the current recent secretaries of defenses, respond at the speed of relevance in our defense acquisition system. Response to emergencies. Obviously right now the overwhelming focus of a lot of the operators in the acquisition system is the COVID crisis and responding to that. There's obviously been response to other natural disasters. During the time that I was focused on these issues, we were very focused on contingency contracting, which is in many ways an emergency of a different sort, at least an emergency for the acquisition system of a different sort. And so there's a whole slew and a suite of authorities relating to emergency response, crisis response. And I think that's an area where there's a tremendous amount of statute that's been adopted over the last 10 years. and an effort to systematize that is incredibly helpful to make us sure that we actually have done what we need to do and have the right oversight measures in place. So I'll kind of pause there. I think there's a lot of goodness in this reorganization effort, and I'm looking forward to, maybe I'm looking too far ahead, but as we get through the process of making sure that we've implemented the reorganization properly, I think we should move expeditiously to identify the seams, the gaps, and the statutes that are no longer needed when you look at them as a collective whole and you see the deadwood that's there, and move quickly to address those as well. I say that with some trepidation. When I was in the department, I would always get a lot of feedback from my colleagues where they said, can Congress just stop changing the law, put the pen down, and let us actually operate this system without so much help? So I recognize that, statute is very much a two-edged sword. It can help and it can hurt. But personally, I think there is still a lot of work to do here.
Great, thank you, Andrew. So we're going to move on to the question and answer, and we really want to start it out with a question from somebody representing, the innovation sector and sort of the non-traditional sector. So I'd like to invite Sam Gray, the Executive Director of the Silicon Valley Defense Group, to open us up with the first question.
Great. Thank you, Wesley. I really appreciate that. Great comments this morning. I welcome the opportunity to talk about this topic that's incredibly important to our group. Silicon Valley Defense Group is a very new 501c3. We are a nonprofit policy-based organization focused on building a durable national security advantage for democracies around the world. When we look at tools like this, the reorganization, what we really, what our members were most interested about and how they can help you is what is that feedback mechanism? I think what Andrew just talked about is a great point of, when are you going to put the pen down and stop taking input? And from the Silicon Valley perspective, the answer would be never, right? This is going to take constant adaptation and updating as we, recognize that some changes were made that maybe weren't in our best interest, and we go back and perfect is the enemy of good enough, right? So what are those mechanisms that those of us outside of government can utilize best to coordinate with the teams that are putting in new language into the NDAA and then implementing the policy inside the Pentagon?
And I invite any of our panelists to chime in.
Well, Sam, I think it's a great question. When I was working on the Hill, and you start with the responsibility to have some agenda for the chairman to adopt in the acquisition arena at the start of the year, or as you go into a new NDAA cycle. It's a daunting responsibility. What should we spending our time on? How to prioritize what is, in effect, some of the most valuable real estate in the world, the access to the Defense Authorization Bill to modify Title X and on an annual basis. It's hard to know where to start. And obviously, you do start with a legislative proposal from DoD. So that's one opportunity. Those bubble up. It's usually a pretty long suggestion from DoD, but there's generally, I would say it's a quarter or less of the provisions that are actually adopted generate from that. So it's coming from members is where a good chunk of the rest of it is coming from, and maybe another quarter is things coming directly from the chairman and the agenda that the full committee chairman, where this responsibility usually lies, is adopting. And it is a little opaque to the general public, I'm sure. How do you get into that process? How do you even nominate something for consideration? There are organizations within Washington that kind of specialize and focus on this, and they, come together either individually as a group, and then something like the Acquisition Reform Working Group that send recommendations every year to the Congress to consider. But it could be a much more open process, and that's probably true of Congress generally. But I'd say, the periodicity, the frequency of NDAAs really creates, I think, something a little different from the standard congressional process in some ways, that we should probably think about ways to open that up more to public comment.
Thank you. That's really helpful. I appreciate it.
And if I could just add briefly as well, I think, we understand that there are different areas of industry that have different viewpoints on how to interpret statutes. They might want additional flexibility. There might be areas where authorities should look different for different parts of our defense industrial base. And so continuing to accept that feedback and then monitoring any changes to statute that might be necessary to address that, I think, is a key part of the process. It's sort of a living, breathing process. And certainly I know the members welcome feedback from all areas of industry. And I think those in Silicon Valley have more recently taken on a more public role in having their voice heard. And I think that's very helpful. I think that's healthy for the broader defense industrial base so that there's a variety and a diversity of opinion on these issues. So thanks for all you're doing there to support that.
Great. Thank you, Samantha.
Just pause to see if Moshe wants to chime in before we go on to the next question.
I think Andrew and Samantha, I'll defer to them. They covered it well.
Very good. All right. We have a question here from, well, I won't say who it's from, but I will say why, this is the question. Why wouldn't you improve the statutory language by including the notes at this time? Codifying the notes would put everything in one place, easily found and clear. The 809 panel clearly identified this as an objective of the recodification it proposed, and I will send that to Moshe first.
Sure. And I think one of the challenges, honestly, is this reorganization itself is so complicated, right, and so difficult that trying to do the notes at the same time might just have been too much, right? So I don't want to speak for the committee. I definitely cannot speak for any of the committees or Congress, but I see the rationale of saying, hey, first let's reorganize it. Let's do the first thing, particularly the first thing that doesn't have any policy implications, doesn't even have a perception of that, even though moving notes doesn't in fact change law because the notes are binding law. But let's get this step done first. And once we get that done, then let's move on to the notes. I think there's a logic in that just from a practical execution perspective.
Great. Samantha, anything to add to that?
Yeah, I think from just my earlier comments, I would echo and say, Congress might decide it doesn't want to preserve all the notes. It may find that once the reorganization has taken place, that a note may be unnecessary, that it may look once everything is reorganized that something's been superseded or it doesn't make sense based on how the acquisition system and organization within the department has changed over time. And so I think allowing, as Moshe said, for that process to take place first, so then we can reassess, are there policy implications here? Do we need to retain all of these notes? I mean, I think that's, at least from my days on the committee, that was how we were looking at it. And I think that's a similar refrain, just making sure that everything still belongs, and then where should it live within the new reorganization most appropriately.
Great. Andrew, anything to add?
Well, I'll just weigh in with one thought, which is, there's actually, why do these things end up as notes in the first place? So they're NDAA provisions, they're statute, but they're not in Title X. So why pass a law and not incorporate it into Title X? And, that's a decision, I guess, that I've had to confront from time to time. And, usually the thinking was, if we don't encodify it, it'll be easier to repeal if it proves that it was a really dumb idea. And believe me, there are some of those. In fact, there's some of them that, quite honestly, we know are dumb when they're done, but they are the outcome of the conference, and so they are the law. And, as staffers, it's not our place to second guess that. But maybe one little way that you can sort of second guess it a little bit is say, well, let's not put it in Title X right away. Let's make it, a freestanding provision. And then if it proves out over time, if this is something we don't find ourselves having to come back and repeal 2 years later, maybe then we can consider codification. And I'm mindful of areas where we have codified things that started out as notes. So, for example, the OTA authority, which lived as a note for actually for decades before finally getting codified, in recent years as a Title X piece. That this is that's that would probably be, in my mind, a case where we probably should have codified it a lot sooner. But generally, the predilection is make it a freestanding provision, give it a time limit so it expires, And then if Congress sees fit to renew it once, maybe twice, now it's something that maybe we don't bring into the code. Now, I'm not arguing that's necessarily the right way to think about it, but that has been the thought process, that things that are in the notes are clearly sort of not yet necessarily ready to be endorsed as enduring provisions of law.
Great, thank you so much. So we touched on this a little bit, but I want to go deeper in. One of the concerns on the defense industrial base is a shrinking supplier base, less folks coming in, less new entrants, et cetera. And many people point to the various barriers to entry. And several have pointed out that just the complexity of the code is one of those great barriers to entry. What do you see this effort as? So it seems to be positive that way, but what effect do you think this will truly have on small businesses, new entrants, and non-traditionals' ability to access the defense marketplace over time? And importantly, and you see this out of the incoming administration with the concerns on supply chain, what do you think will be the overarching effects on supply chain? Are there any fallout effects from that? And I'll start with Andrew.
Yeah, great question, Wes. And I think it's a central one because, again, thinking of it with kind of a system mindset, right? The industrial base is a core element of the system. And if you look at the statute and just think of it as almost like a computer code, right? Programmer language, you can evaluate it in one sense. You can say, do all the subroutines connect? That's one way of thinking about it. Another, to me, you also have to think about it as this is something that is designed to support, enable the defense acquisition system and to shape the industrial base towards the image of what we hope that it will be. And so if you look at some of the statutory requirements imposed on industry, like TINA, the Truth in Negotiation Act, or other things that govern industry, False Claims Act is another one that comes to mind, although arguable whether you consider that a defense acquisition statute or not. These are things that shape the industrial base and that give us an outcome of what industry can do, what capabilities it's positioned to provide to DoD. And in many cases, obviously statute is a huge barrier to entry and it keeps people out. And some of that is, how rigorous, the high level of requirements that are there, what can happen to you if you don't comply with the statutes, which can be quite profound for a company to deal with. And some of it's just the opacity of it, right? Like, how does someone even begin to grapple with all these requirements without, bringing on an expert to walk them through? And that obviously is a cost. So I think we do have to think hard about the pressures and the shaping and the influencing that the code has on the industrial base. And I do think the reorganization will help to make that much clearer. I think it also, though, can have an enabling effect in the other direction, right? Because sometimes people say, we can't do X, Y, or Z because, the FAR doesn't allow it or Title 10 doesn't allow it. Well, Title 10 actually allows quite a lot. You go through and you look at all these provisions in the notes, like, there's all kinds of crazy authorities, So I'm going to invoke a name here of another prior colleague, which is Bill Greenwalt, who would go out of his way to find old provisions of law. I'm going to use the word esoteric in some cases, provisions of law that could enable us to get around the system, right? The system, the parts of the system that maybe Bill didn't fully appreciate or enjoy. So, he would find these, provisions of law and he'd say, hey, it looks to me like this enables, any kind of rapid prototyping effort we might want to do. And, he would kind of try to rediscover or redeploy some of those. So I think there is this element of, by reorganizing, we can remind ourselves all the flexibilities that are actually there in the code.
Yeah, I think that's great. Moshe, anything to add to that?
Sure, I'll just add a couple of things. One is, Andrew made the point, should it be that you need an expert to understand this? I'm going to go further and say, I don't think all the experts understand it. I can tell you I've purportedly been doing this for a long time. I'll find things that I'm like, really, that's there? In fact, a few years ago, I was talking from somebody at DIIG who was an expert in a particular legal issue. I'm not going to call him out. And he said, Moshe, I've been doing this for a decade. I just found this note I didn't know existed. Right? That is not uncommon. It is crazy. And I'll just give one example. Just look at 10 U.S.C. 2302, right? It's a page and a half of legislative text. It has 93 pages of notes if you print it out. So forget being an expert, if you're just a company and you say, oh, let me see what the law says, and you print out the legislative text and you think you're looking at the law, no, you're not. Because you need to look at all the notes under that section. And not only do you need to look at all the notes under that section, you better know every other section that may have a note that is referenced there because they have not been reorganized in so long that it's not logical anymore. So that would be my take.
Great. And Samantha?
Yeah, I think, just to address specifically your comment on supply chain, Wes, I do think there are several supply chain restrictions, considerations that have been passed in the last 5 years in particular. And just from, where I sit at Covington advising companies on how to handle all of these new laws and regulations, it is challenging sometimes when you have to sift through all the previous NDAAs and figure out what actually has a regulation, what doesn't because it was due, but the FAR Council hasn't issued a regulation. And is there an opportunity to be involved? And what are all of these considerations that we need to make sure we follow? And that's very hard for non-traditional defense companies and new entrants because they're just trying to figure out, number one, how do they do business with government? Number two, are there cost accounting standards they have to meet and all of that complication? Maybe they're doing it another way through an OTA, but then they realize, oh, there are all these supply chain regulations that apply across the board to everybody. And where are all of those? And I do think an organization that appropriately categorizes some of these things will be helpful. And I see that as helpful to the government in addition to industry, because the government wants people to comply. They want trusted, secure partners, and industry wants to comply because they don't want any of their systems or supply chain to be compromised any more than the department does. But how do we know what all of those restrictions are when they're not organized? And, certainly there are a lot of great resources at places like NDIAA and CSIS to educate the industrial base on that. But having an organization that's, easy to follow for in-house general counsel and folks advising these companies would be very helpful. And I think it would drive a better solution for both government and industry.
Excellent. I'm going to stay with you, Samantha. There are some that believe that there may be some unintended consequences from this effort. What do you believe is the possibility of substantive change in meaning of a provision or a former note? If so, where do you see that risk as most likely, and how can the writers mitigate that risk?
Sure. So I guess I would say, based on the comments today, I do think the intent is to not have substantive changes, that this really is a reorganization, but certainly it is one that has to be looked at carefully. And I think where the risk lies is, number one, if Congress were to decide they were eliminating notes, either because the program, that the note applied to wasn't being used, the authority was irrelevant, it had been overtaken. I think those are technically substantive changes, but you could also consider them technical in nature as sort of code cleanup, and there could be confusion. I think what's important there is that Congress and the department and everyone looking at this clearly messages, either through report language or reporting requirements, why those decisions were made, so there's transparency and industry can understand why the decision was made. I think through the process also, just because there are so many notes, there will be things that overlap, and it may actually be necessary to make changes so that it just reads in a way that is sensical, right? There might be two notes that are kind of doing the same thing, but there's a little difference, and maybe the way they want to roll them in to have a clear path to follow might look like a substantive change, but it might not be. And so I think those are the things that will be, that industry will be watching for. And again, I think that can be clarified easily through transparency and messaging. When we used to, I think Andrew described this at the beginning, where the House is kind of the end all be all on the bill language and the Senate is on the report language in conference. And you could write these beautiful detailed descriptions of what the language does, as we did with the military retirement reform. You can be very painful in describing it. But then there are other times when, you're up against the deadline, you're getting it done, and the report language says, Section 17 creates an entire new system for this. And you're like, okay, but like how, what did it do? Delete, and you have to kind of go in and do the red line, and that's, that is what happens when you're dealing with such a large piece of legislation. But I think on these provisions in particular, it is important to have a careful description of how some of the changes were made, either through messaging on the overall changes, through report language, there are a lot of different avenues for this. So I don't mean to put all of this back on my former colleagues. I think it's a role all of us can play.
Great. Moshe?
Sure. I think there are two ways that you can do your best to make sure there are no unintended consequences. One is, which is what was done in the FY21 NDAA, is use the transfer and redesignate method, where you're not restating the law, but you're saying take what is here and move it there, right? So you're not trying to clean it up, or like what the Title 41 reorg did, where you try to clean up English too, where sometimes the word and or where you put the comma could actually make a difference. Just transfer and redesignate. That's a technique that is very helpful in guarding against unintended consequences. Not perfect, but very useful. And I think the second one, which is represented by exactly what we're doing here, is what Congress did, is delay an exposure, right? Give everybody an opportunity to comment. So the way this is working now is anybody who looks can say, oh, here's something, let's fix it, and let Congress know, because I believe they'll take that step because they've made it very clear that is our intent. So I think the transfer and redesignate and the public exposure and time to really allow people to take that exposure and comment is the best thing we can do, but we can't be perfect. Over.
Great. Andrew, anything to add?
Maybe just the thought that, would be not readily evident necessarily to someone who hasn't worked through the process in Congress, that, there are, when you pass legislation is generally intended to be a substantive change. That's the point, right? If you're not making a substantive change, why would you go through the hassle and the effort of passing a law? But then there are certain processes within the broader legislative process that are designed to be non-substantive in nature, technical corrections. And, there's a faith in the system that people engage in that in good faith and aren't going to try and slip something past their colleagues, dressing it up as a technical correction, but in fact, it's a policy change. And so, in effect, I think we're asking the public to help support or back up the good faith effort that I think the Congress engaged in to make this incredibly painful and labor-intensive effort one that is inconsistent with the theory or the logic of a technical correction. And this kind of gets back to the earlier question about why not move all the notes. It's because we're trying. I think the Congress is trying to make sure that they're living up to the spirit of the collegiality of the process. That this effort is a technical one, but it will support and enable policy-related changes down the road.
Great. I want to thank everybody for submitting their questions. I do want to, realizing we have 5 minutes left, I'm going to finish with one of the submitted questions, which is DOD has been very resistant to Congress or themselves designating a significant initiative within an MDAP as a major sub-program because of the additional reporting requirements it might entail. A prime example has been the Technical Refresh 3 Block 4 upgrade effort inside the F-35 program. What underlying criteria and qualifiers do you believe should exist within an MDAP to warrant designation of major sub-programs within an MDAP? And I'll start with you, Andrew.
Yeah, so having related the comment of how I spent, many hours of my life trying to perfect the legislative language around sub-programs, it's great to be reminded that no one's using it. So thanks for that. I think the logic of it is one worth spending a little time on. So I think I'm trying to remember now exactly what examples the department gave us when we undertook that effort. But let me think, for example, of DDG 51, which is an MDAP of long duration. Ships first fielded in the 80s that we're continuing to field, and now you're on Flight 3, the Navy, which is in effect in many ways an entirely new ship. And so you want to be able to track those newer emerging efforts without all the baggage, if you will, of the things that happened in 1987 that led to a cost overrun or or not let a more recent cost overrun be in effect suppressed by, the work that was done decades ago on the program. Now, of course, you get an interesting example in the case of F-35, because when you go through a full-up Nunn-McCurdy breach, you kind of get a reset. So the F-35 program is one where we've had a couple resets, and you don't have necessarily all the back history of the program still driving the numbers within the reporting system. But I think it is important to have the ability to carve out efforts within a broader MDAP that are clearly related, as in, I think, the DIIG 51 example, but to be able to track them separately. So to me, the logic is sound. Now, as we get into programs where you have, I'm hoping that we will be able to demonstrate an ability to do much more rapid block upgrades and technology refresh efforts on things like the F-35 and on a whole range of other systems. And to stay with my example on DDG 51 type ships, where we can do updates to the combat system for rapid reaction to electronic warfare capabilities that we may run into on the battlefield. In many cases, that's not going to be something that you want to designate formally as a subprogram. There's too much bureaucracy around that. But sometimes you will. So I think the idea of having it, the possibility is a good one, is an important one. Now, the issue of if no one's using it because it's too bureaucratic and complex, it's probably a signal that someone needs to go back and fix the things I got wrong.
Great, thank you. Realize we have 2 minutes. I'm going to leave with you, Andrew, for some closing comments for you, and I'll do the same for Samantha and for Moshe.
So just in closing, I think there is, during this review period, right, this 1 year period, while we're kind of looking at the technical issues in the statute, I really would encourage folks to submit to the NDAA comment page, identify those. I know that's kind of a niche community that's going to want to do that or take that on, but I really think it's a critical effort, because if we don't fix any little mistakes that may have crept in, and inevitably they do, I think it could really serve as a barrier to getting to those deeper policy questions that I'm hoping we will get to in the coming years, and identify the gaps. And I do think there's gaps. One that I want to kind of nominate that I think is something that's going to take real focus is, our ability to do development of software in the defense acquisition system. And I think our statutory framework is not well postured or aligned for that, either in terms of what it imposes and in terms of gaps that, where it just doesn't provide authorities or doesn't shape appropriate oversight. So that's one that I think we definitely need to look at.
I would like to associate myself with those remarks as well. Over to Samantha.
Thank you, and thanks again to NDIA and CSIS for hosting this great conversation today, and for all the panelists' participation. I agree with Andrew's comments, and I also think that it's important, once ultimately the results start coming out on this, that there's a feedback loop that comes after the fact as well. There are always technical changes that can be made. Staff is used to that, and I think open to hearing where there are questions and concerns. And it sounds like there's a very robust effort going on with DoD to ensure that they coordinate with the Hill and this all gets done in a proper manner. But there will always be little things, and so great to stay involved. And then I would just sort of expand on Andrew's comments by saying, particularly to Sam Gray from Silicon Valley Defense Group and other non-traditional defense contractors listening in on the call today, your voices are very critical to this piece as well, and would be great to make sure those are also heard.
Great, thanks. And we'll end it off with Moshe.
Thanks, and just do a quick comments. Obviously, thank you all for inviting me and all the panelists. And I guess my first point would be to encourage Congress to keep on this effort. This is a rare opportunity to do such a comprehensive effort to really set the framework and the ground for future efforts and some serious reform. And then the second, which I really want to emphasize, is Andrew mentioned, all the mistakes that he made on the Hill for people to point out. I don't think he made any mistakes on the Hill. I've seen all that stuff, and I thought it was all great. So just leave with that thought.
Outstanding. I do want to make sure everybody knows that NDIA will leave that link up for the next 2 months to gather your inputs to this effort. So please take the time and fill that out, and we will pass those on accordingly. With that, again, I want to thank Andrew and all of the team at CSIS for helping put this together, and to our panelists. Thank you so much, and thank you for a great conversation.